Hey everybody, back on the Aston project. So gonna walk around the entire drivetrain, just about ready to put in the car. So if we pan up here, we have the empty chassis. I wanted to be cool like Tavares and put some gold foil up. So this is some gold Mylar heat rejection stuff behind the factory heat shielding. Just to try to continue to make it as cool as possible in the car, keep all the heat back down underneath. So looking back at the drivetrain, there has been quite a few modifications since last time I showed it. If we look over here at the water pump, right here and down here, we converted those to AN fittings. We have a 16 AN up top and a 20 AN down at the bottom. This is based on a Holley accessory drive for the LT4, but it's been redone because like everything, it doesn't quite work the way it would have come. So factory right up here would have been the AC mount, but that and the frame rail on this chassis have a strong disagreement on who gets to exist, and in this case the frame rail needs to win that. So I have what should be a high mount AC mount kit, and then I've got the alternator down here. The rest of this is just normal Holley. We've got their power steering setup, which I think is pretty slick with the way it takes the load off of the pulley, but way buried down here is the AC compressor. The subframe's tilted up a little bit, so it's got a little bit less clearance than it really will, but I machined a custom bracket to put it there. Up above it here, this is the power steering pressure side, so that comes back through down to the steering rack and then goes through the factory Aston system back. This rubber hose right here is the feed side. That'll go to the stock Aston Martin power steering reservoir. And then over on the other side, we have a couple of heater hoses. That's what you see right here. These connect back up to the water pump. They have these Gates shrink wrap style clamps. I like those a lot better anywhere that I can use them. I think they look a little bit cleaner. They're single use, but these on the far end, these will get shortened and they'll connect to the factory Aston Martin coolant lines. And those actually have a quick disconnect on them. So that should allow me to use a quick disconnect in the future. So I will use a heat shrink seal on that side. And then headers are on. These are just C7 Z06 headers, so nothing too crazy there. You can also see the harness is on. I have moved it around a little bit. This area right here is pretty tight to the firewall, so I've moved the harness over just a little bit to get the clearance right here where it's tight. So that gives me a little bit more there. I've also moved the fuel line. So on the Corvette, the fuel line comes out on the driver's side. On the Aston, it's on the US passenger side. So I've got this piece of tubing, which also allowed me to put the flex fuel sensor kind of in line here behind the blower. I've got some room under the cowl here, so that allows that to fit. It comes back through. It's clipped down here just to keep it a little bit more controlled. And I've got a bulkhead fitting here that gives me a quick disconnect point for it and just keeps that under control. So that aluminum line isn't bouncing around too much. It's very well supported throughout it, because if you don't do that, it will have a tendency to crack. Last but not least, up on the top here, I've got this DSX blower lid. Supposed to be worth a little bit of horsepower. For my nickel, I just wanted it because it doesn't say Corvette all over it, and I want to kind of screw with people's heads when they look at this car. I think I'm actually going to have a little plaque machine for where this says LT4. I'm going to put a little plaque here that says Aston Martin. Again, not trying to be sneaky really, but just want to screw with people who kind of don't know better. So outside of that, coming back, we have all the clutch hydraulics. This is this one here. This is just a speed bleeder. And then this is the actual clutch hydraulics. This will connect back to the factory Aston system. I converted that to 4AN on the other side of that. And then this is just a C5 style slave cylinder in there. It's actually been shimmed out. There's a little shim here that allowed me to set this gap just right. Something about the stack up in combination with this clutch assembly made my stack up a little bit too tight, and I needed a little more air gap. So I had that little spacer aluminum cut to fill the gap. And then just a second and we'll come back and go over the training section. All right, so next section on here, we have the rest of the torque tube and drivetrain. So this transaxle is out of a C6 Grand Sport, so same as a Z06, essentially functionally. I think the gearing might be slightly different, but roughly the same. If we look down here, we can see where this has been pocketed and re-welded to give me a little bit more clearance. So if we look up into the tunnel, it's very, very tight right there, kind of where that bell shape is. And this and that had an argument. So both sides of that have been pocketed and welded, and then they're welded on the inside and outside. So if you look at this and go, hey, this idiot ground it back, that's all right. It was all cut back so that I had to fill it with weld so that I could grind it back, and then it's welded on both sides. So not to say that I'm not still an idiot, but that isn't part of why. So then right here, this is where the torque tube was actually cut and shortened. So I had that done by RPM transmission. I don't have the necessary gear to do that and keep everything nice and straight. So they went ahead and shortened this torque tube for me. And then Drive Shaft Shop did a custom internal prop shaft for it. So it's all been rebuilt, new guibos front and rear, all new bolts, all new bearings, all new hardware, all that stuff, and custom lengthened or custom shortened. I think it's 3.5, 4 inches shorter than stock. So that'll allow this to fit back in place. And then this shifter linkage has been shortened. It does look a little bit, if you can tell, it's angled a little bit there. That is on purpose to keep everything kind of where it needs to be. So this used to have a big jog in it because the shifter used to sit offset. But in order for it to come up in the right spot in the Aston, it needs to sit in the center. And this is our shifter. This is a Tech Performance shifter. Because I didn't have any of the shifter parts, this seemed like the best option because they included with everything. So I didn't need essentially a shifter to sacrifice. So I didn't have to buy a shifter to sacrifice to work on it. So anyway, this is all put together. If we look at the shifter, it feels really nice. So I can get through all the gears. It's nicely centered. I don't have final spacers made. So the spacers are just a stack of some aluminum spacers and nuts and things. So once this is in the car and I get a chance to kind of finalize the exact height, I'll machine a set of those. There's a big opening in the car where I can reach this and change those out. So that's not too big of a deal. I did go with a weighted stainless steel shifter ball. I'm a big fan of these. I kind of like the way they feel. The weight, I feel, just makes the shifting feel a little bit nicer. So I did that, and I feel with the style of the interior, it won't look too out of place. I never really liked the factory Aston Martin shift knob. It just felt a little bit cheaper than the rest of it. I mean, it's leather and it's nice and stuff, but just, I don't know. It wasn't quite my favorite thing. So again, here's our passenger side header. If we look, there was a little bit of clearancing to the subframe there to make it fit. We can also see, if you look down behind that cable, behind everything, you can see there's some heat shielding on the engine mount where it's also close to the header. Just try to keep everything nice and happy. As I finish some of the other plumbing, I will be going ahead and putting some heat shielding on all of that as well. Basically anything within about 4 or 5 inches of the headers will get some kind of heat shielding on it. Just try to keep everything nice and happy and reliable. So outside of that, back here we have what looks like a giant mess. There's some organized chaos, but that is all of my rear suspension arms. Those have been completely taken down, scrubbed clean, scotch brighted. Not trying to polish them or build a show car, just trying to get them to be in decent condition. And then I've got to swap all the bushings out with those with some polyurethane ones. And then these are my half shafts that are going to get some surgery to build mock-ups so that I can get custom half shafts made. But I got to put this drivetrain back in yet. So that's going to be next up. So we're going to get started on that here in just a moment. And then I'll get another video of it with it back in the car.
All right, so we're gonna have a super professional transition here in that I'm just gonna jump cut from this drivetrain sitting on the floor to the drivetrain in the car. But taking a look at it from underneath, it's a little bit of a mess right now because I've got a whole bunch of hoses that are kind of scabbed in. It's a lot easier to connect all the hoses when the drivetrain's sitting on the floor instead of in the engine bay. Particularly since if you look all the way out there's the nose and all the way back there is the crankshaft. So actually, So if we look over to the sides, right, the crankshaft is actually behind the center line of the wheels, or right about in line with the center line of the wheels, the end of the crankshaft. So it's pretty far back in there, which makes connecting things and working on it in the engine bay a bit of a pain in the butt. So I tried to connect as much as I could before I did. Anyway, so I've got a bunch of harness hanging down here and hoses and things that are all going to get patched in. Trying to reuse as much of the factory stuff as I can or other OEM applications. So I've got an aftermarket dry sump tank that gets mounted and aftermarket breather system, but I'm using a Chevy Volt coolant bottle for the supercharger coolant. And then I'm using the actual original Aston Martin degas tank, and Aston Martin power steering. So rolling back, we got a smashed oil filter here that just happened in the crate, but it's holding the oil in place right now. Right back here, I need to get the heat shield put back in now that this is getting closer to permanent, so that I can start building the exhaust. So there's a heat shield that goes up above this. There's plenty of room to slide it in with what's in place now, but it keeps the heat off the floorboard a little bit. And then same thing here, there's a brace that sits right here, and then a heat shield that goes between the bottom of the torque tube and that. But as we roll back, we can see that everything is nicely centered. And if we look back here, if you look at where, let's see if I can point right here with my out of focus finger on each side. There we go, let's break the focus. That is where I had pocketed the end of the torque tube bell. So inside of that torque tube, right, it's only about 6-inch diameter. So the bell mouthing just happens so that it can meet up to the transmission case effectively. So I'm not losing any risk of any clearance problems inside. So those were pocketed to make it so that the floor pan clears there, which again allowed me to move the transmission further forward. And then if we come back here, we can see the transaxle is in place. Right up here, also breaking focus, but that shaft right there, or that piece of that reinforcement bar right there, is removable. So I have a roll bar tube dropouts to allow me to drop that out, because otherwise getting the transmission and drivetrain in would suck. So that allows that to fit. It does have about 1/4 of an inch of clearance, 3/8 of an inch of clearance to the differential, and the same with this cross brace here. It's got a little less than 1/2 inch of clearance to the transmission case. And then right here on either side, those are my transmission mounts. So those use a big honking poly bushing on the other side, and then they're just reinforced 1/4 inch steel plate that picks up the factory GM transmission points. So behind that, right here, this clearancing was done. I'm running the Grand Sport transaxle, which has a diff cooler and a transmission cooler in it, and I wanted to keep that functionality. So something in the angle of the camera makes that look like it's not straight. It is square, but basically I cut out the subframe, reinforced it, and then added plates behind it to tie it all back in. So it's all X-braced back, and then there's a 1/4 inch plate that ties it back in. So not going anywhere, still plenty strong, but gives me enough clearance to fit the whole back of the transaxle in the cooler. And then this big pocket kind of right back here, this is where the factory muffler goes. So again, I don't have a factory muffler, but I've got a Velocity AP piece. And then if we look here, I did go through, my rear subframe was in good shape already, but I went ahead and cleaned it all up and then painted it all so that it would stay nice and clean. So again, we'll roar back through. Over on the side right here, this is where the fuel lines will go. So this is gonna be a returnless system to the high pressure pump up front. So I'll get that put in next, along with the wiring and plumbing. I gotta put the heat shield back on the starter here and a few other things underneath. And then once everything is all buttoned up, I have the Vantage S / Roadster shear plates that bolt underneath to add a little bit more rigidity. So I did add, here, we'll roll back to the back real quick. On the side, let's see if we can point right here and right here on each side. You can see them on the other side too. This is a 2007, so the subframe did not have those bars there, or those mounting tabs, and the same with the 3 back here. Those allow me to use a Vantage S / Roadster shear plate on the back as well. And then there's some riv nuts added to the body. If you look right here, those are riv nuts that were added to allow me to bolt in those shear plates. So I can't fully bolt them on right now because the lift interferes with where one of them is, because I lifted it up without those in place. But that'll just give me a little bit more rigidity in the chassis. Anything I can do to tie things in a little bit better is pretty much good news. So outside of that, next up is going to be working on the wiring and plumbing up front, getting that taken care of, and then getting the fuel system in. Once that's in, I'm going to put some fluids in the engine and transmission and make sure that this thing starts and runs. Once it starts and runs, we'll fill it with coolant, and then I will figure out the half shafts in the back. And then that should be just about everything to get it running. There's some electronics work that will need to get done still as well. but that's a little bit more tertiary to the rest of it. So anyway, that's a quick status update on the car. I am currently laying on a furniture dolly on my floor because that's the only way to move underneath it, because I am too tall to fit underneath my lift. Well, I mean, I fit underneath, but I cause myself a lot of concussions. So we're going to try to avoid that. So like I said, next up, I'll start sharing some shots in the engine bay as I start getting the plumbing and wiring cleaned up a little bit. I've got to sort out the ECU mount for the General Motors ECU, and then I'm going to tie all the wiring in on the car. The wiring setup that I'm going to use, the factory harness for the Aston passes through and kind of lines up nicely with where I want to put the GM ECU, roughly the same location it was in the Corvette. So I'm essentially just going to pirate all that wiring that already runs through, break it all out, and then tie it back on, tie back in the interior and the fuse box and things. So the objective, basically, everything will run pretty much like stock as far as the chassis is concerned. There's a few codes that it'll set. I did hack the CAN bus before I tore the car apart, which allows me to replicate the messages that it wants to keep it happy, or at least turn off the lights. So there won't be any error lights on it, or at least there shouldn't be any error lights on it once it's all put together, and then all the gauges will work like stock. So that'll be upcoming, but getting the engine running is a higher priority than kind of working through all the dash stuff. I can sort that out once the car's on the road, and I've debugged any major things that require me to drop this drivetrain back out, or other equally unfun tasks. So anyway, everybody wanted a video to kind of update where I'm at. So that's a quick video to update where I'm at. Like I said, next up, wiring, plumbing, fuel system, and then finishing the rear suspension so that I can sort out the bushings and figure out the half shafts there. So anyway, thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, post them down below. Thanks.